He spoke about it recently at Colby College in Maine for an hour 15 minutes.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate Young America's Foundation and the Cultural Events Committee here at Colby bringing me out. The topic of my speech tonight is my new book, which is called Intellectual Morons, How Ideology Makes Smart People Fall for Stupid Ideas. I'm a big fan of subtle titles, as you can tell. My last book was called Why the Left Hates America, and people are still trying to figure out what I was trying to say there. Anyhow, the thesis of my book and of the talk tonight is that ideology acts as a mental straitjacket. It blinds adherence to reality, it breeds fanaticism, and it justifies dishonesty. Ideology makes smart people stupid. People ask me, well, Dan, what is an intellectual moron? And I guess the definition of it would be that an intellectual moron is someone who is blessed with great cognitive abilities, but who squanders those gifts by relying on his ideology rather than his brain to do his thinking. Perhaps you've encountered people like this in your years here at Colby or elsewhere. I wrote this book as an antidote to indoctrination that you see on many campuses. And in the real world, when you encounter things like deconstructionism, radical feminism, environmentalism, a lot of these ideologies, which are comprised of people that are very stubborn in their beliefs and are sort of impenetrable to logic and reasoning, in the outside world, these folks are often mocked. But they are taken very seriously in lecture halls around the country. They're given a great, gravity and almost accepted uncritically. And the point of the book is to say the emperor has no clothes. That a lot of these ideologies rest on a house of cards that give a little nudge and it's going to come down. The book focuses, Intellectual Morons focuses mainly on, as the title suggests, intellectuals. But the thesis of the book also applies to current controversies. So it's not just distant academics that I'm talking about, but it also applies to people that are very much in the news, maybe more moron than intellectual, but the thesis that ideology acts as a blinding force applies to them as well. We saw this about a month ago with the Rathergate scandal, where you had Dan Rather and Mary Mapes running with this story about the National Guard documents with President Bush, not because of the facts suggested that the story was true, but because there was a desired outcome. A, they wanted to beat the other news organizations with the story, but B, and I think as importantly, CBS, if you don't live on a cloud, you pretty much figure out by now that CBS is a little bit different from the other networks in the sense that there is a much more discernible liberal bias there. And they were more concerned with the outcome of their story, what political ramifications would occur. And if you remember back, there was, when the controversy was just breaking, and people were arguing that the documents that they put forward that purported to show that the president got favorable treatment, which he may or may not have gotten, those documents were, very early on labeled as a hoax by a bunch of bloggers. I'm a blogger. I have my own blog, flynnfiles.com, and I have great respect for a lot of these folks, but it is sort of amazing that you would have lone, watchdogs sitting in their basements, correcting, a humongous news organization. And CBS came out and said, no, this is nonsense. This story, we have an unimpeachable source. That was what CBS said. Now, we know who their unimpeachable source is now. It was a guy named Bill Burkett, who was a partisan hack, was someone who compared Bush to Adolf Hitler, and who seems to have had a history of mental problems. If you believe that that gentleman is an unimpeachable source, you are either A, a liar, or B, you have very bad judgment. And in either case, you don't belong in journalism. You see the influence of ideology as a blinding force with Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, where one of the central claims, who has seen Fahrenheit 9/11? Me too. About half the people here have seen it. I saw it this summer, and one thing that really jumped out at me was when he claimed, one of the central claims made in the movie is, or it's an insinuation, there's really no claims in the movie, just a bunch of insinuations and nudges and that kind of thing, and Moore makes the insinuation that we went to war in Afghanistan because of the Union Oil Company of California wanting to build an oil pipeline in Afghanistan. And there's a problem with this, and the problem is that Union Oil in the late 1990s decided to abandon this plan. They announced they weren't going to do it anymore. And we have been in Afghanistan now for almost 3 years. There's no pipeline. There's no plans for a pipeline. The pipeline exists in Michael Moore's head, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. I think also this kind of delusional thinking was evident, and I hate to alienate any of my fellow conservatives in the audience, but I think it was also evident to an extent in the lead up to the Iraq War, where there was sort of the Bush administration had their own little Rathergate fiasco, where they had a forged document which they based some claims on that Saddam was pursuing enriched uranium from Niger, something to that effect, and later it came out that the documents were forged, and some of the people that I read online said, well, the documents might be forged, but the story's still true. And that was a little bit like what Dan Rather did. And you could say the same thing with the sort of exaggerations with regard to weapons of mass destruction stockpiles and people imagining that Saddam Hussein was somehow behind 9/11. He's a bad guy, but obviously that's a bit of a stretch. And so my point in saying all that is that Intellectual Morons, the book, the whole idea of it is about ideology. It's not about left ideology. It's not about right ideology. It's about the dangers inherent in all ideology to sort of delude people, to make them not think, to make them sort of react to events in a programmed manner. Now, the quintessential intellectual moron can be found on any number of college campuses. I want to speak briefly about 3 of these intellectual morons and of what I think is the most dangerous type, which is people that are not only stubbornly wedded to an idea, no matter what the facts say, but stubbornly wedded to a utopian idea, basically believing that if their idea comes to fruition, they will save the world. And that's a really dangerous way to think, because if you believe that your idea is going to save the world, what would you do to make that idea happen? You do just about anything. And usually the saving the world part doesn't happen, but all the bad stuff, the ends justifying the means and that kind of thing, that does happen. An example of this would be, and let me give you 3 examples. One example, someone who has gotten a lot of renewed attention the last decade or so, is W.E.B. DuBois, who is rightly admired as one of the founders of the NAACP, but a lot of his other history is sort of brushed under the rug, brushed under the carpet. DuBois was a communist. He was someone who renounced his American citizenship. He got kicked out of the NAACP because he promoted racial separatism as a means to combat racial separatism, and obviously that went against the tenets of the NAACP. He was someone that proudly accepted the Lenin Peace Prize in 1959, eulogized Stalin as a great and courageous man, attacked and slandered as no other man in history has been. This was W.E.B. Du Bois as well. Basically, Du Bois viewed any enemy of the United States as necessarily a good guy. So he went to Nazi Germany before World War II and came back with some tempered, but in a lot of ways glowing reports about Nazi Germany, saying that Hitler's Germany was the second greatest example of Marxism on planet Earth at the time. And unlike me, he uses that term Marxism in a positive way. He looked at this as a good thing. He came back with glowing reports about Imperial Japan, saying all sorts of nice things. So the point of this, Du Bois was a very smart man, obviously a lot more intelligent than I am, but he was someone who didn't use his brain. He believed in an idea. He thought that communism was going to save the world, and whatever he could do to bring that about, he would do. In the Soviet Union, what they did to bring communism about was, they killed a lot of people. He obviously didn't do that, but he did lie. He lied about Stalin. He lied about the conditions of the Soviet Union. He lied about the conditions of China. He was someone that viewed the ends justifying the means. And he attempted to do this by discrediting America, but he ended up just discrediting himself. You look at someone like Margaret Sanger, who was probably a lot more activist than intellectual. Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood. She's known today mostly as the matron saint of the abortion rights movement. Time magazine a couple years back, or 4 years back, had a story on the 100 most important people of the 20th century, and Sanger was one of those 100 people. And I think they were right for including her. She was certainly a towering figure in the 20th century. But there's a lot left out of the official biography of Margaret Sanger. I went in to the Library of Congress where her papers are kept. And within about an hour of looking at her personal papers and effects, I came across what is probably the most despicable thing that I have ever read in my entire life. And it's a speech that she gave called A Plan for Peace. She gave it in 1932. I brought a copy of it. And I think realistically, anyone looking at this speech can say, well, gee, Margaret Sanger is the original feminazi. She is, so let me read you some of it. What Sanger wanted to do was set up a system of concentration camps in the United States. This is at the very time that prefacing when Hitler came to power in Nazi Germany. She wanted that type of Nazism in America. And this is what she wrote. She wanted the government to apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of the population whose progeny is already tainted. She went on to say that she would give certain dysgenic groups in our population their choice of segregation or sterilization. That's quite a choice, huh? She went on to say she wanted to apportion farmlands and homestead for these segregated persons where they would be taught to work under competent instructors for the period of their entire lives. These people would include illiterates, paupers, unemployables, criminals, prostitutes, dope fiends, and these people would be classified in special departments under government medical protection and segregate them on farms and open spaces as long as necessary for the strengthening and development of moral conduct. And just to conclude on this point, she said, having corralled this enormous part of our population and placed it on a basis of health instead of punishment, it is safe to say that 15 or 20 million of our population would then be organized into soldiers of defense, defending the unborn against their own disabilities. That sounds a lot like Adolf Hitler. There's no way around that. And yet, what is even more disturbing to me, or equally as disturbing, is what Margaret Sanger wrote, the matron saint of the abortion rights movement, is the reaction to this by historians, which has been to look the other way. I looked at about a dozen biographies of Sanger. Not one of them makes even a fleeting reference to this. They classify her as a champion of reproductive freedom and choice. That's a bit confusing to me. You can be for government compulsory sterilization. You can be for reproductive freedom. You can't be for both. Never the twain shall meet. And because you can't be for both, this was excluded from their biographies. Now, these historians had access to the very same material that I had, and the fact that I stumbled upon it within an hour of embarking upon my research suggests to me, since they quote from a lot of the same material, that they saw this, but yet they chose to exclude it. They chose to exclude the fact that one of the most famous women of the 20th century argued for slavery, government-forced sterilization, and concentration camps in the United States. This is kind of a black mark that would negate, a lot of the other stuff that she did. At least we should be able to consider this. But they want to shield this information from us. These historians have sought to hide the truth rather than to find the truth. They played public relations men for Margaret Sanger because they are in agreement with her general philosophy and they don't want to do anything that would discredit her. We live in a democracy. We live in a Republican form of government. We should be allowed to make choices. We should be given the information, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then be allowed to make the choice. But these historians want to play gatekeeper. It's almost sort of a totalitarian mindset that goes into someone who would hide this information from the public. Think about it in these terms. Imagine if a prominent pro-life figure had at one point argued for a massive system of concentration camps in the United States that would imprison about 1 out of every 7 people in this room. Do you think that any of these same historians would have deemed this information unworthy of inclusion in a biography.